Welcome back to the channel and welcome to the first reading wrap up in the new office. If you've not seen my most recent videos, I've been shuffling around in the house a little bit. My partner and I swapped offices and I went through a whole journey to get these bookshelves set up. So if you want to see that video, I'll link it in the description. But I'm super excited to have it now as the background to talk to you about what I've been reading and loving. And today we're going to be talking about my winter reading. So the best books that I read in December, January, and February. That's December 2024 and January and February of 2025. And today I've got 5 books that I want to talk to you about. But before we get to that, of course, let's look at all of the books that I read during that time. Lock in your time-stamped guesses now as to which ones are going to be my favorite. You can also guess which ones I DNF'd because there were quite a few DNFs over the last 3 months. I'm getting very, very good at DNFing books, especially library books, because why are we incurring fines for books we're not enjoying? You will see right now up on the screen all of the Bone Season books by Samantha Shannon. That's books 1 through 5, including the brand new one. And yes, it only came out at the end of February, but I actually read it in January because I had an arc. And the reason I had an arc is because I'm interviewing Samantha Shannon on the 11th of March. So I think you're going to see this on Friday the 7th. So 4 days after this video goes live, I'm going to be interviewing Samantha Shannon. I'm going to try to record some of that to put on the channel, but I don't yet know if that's going to be possible. So make sure you're subscribed if you want to see that. The first 3 were rereads for me, but if you don't know anything about the Bone Season, basically books 1 through 4, I think, were re-released with an author's preferred version. So they actually updated a bunch of stuff, changed some things. And in my rereads, I read the author's preferred text because I hadn't read those and it was really interesting. And also the new book is great. And I'm not going to talk about those as part of my top 5 because I obviously, I was rereading them because of the event that I'm doing. I do highly recommend them. If you've never heard of them before, they're basically set in the future where the UK is an empire called the Republic of Scion. And there are voyants or clairvoyants who have different types of magic, but they have to live in hiding. And our protagonist, Paige, is a very rare type of voyant, and she works in the sort of criminal underworld of London as sort of the second in command for a crime boss. But one day she's captured and she's sent to Oxford, which everyone thought had been destroyed. And it turns out it's now a city-sized prison for humans run by a race of creatures called the Rephite. They're kind of aliens, but they also are magical like voyants and they feed on voyants' power. And the Rephites also are sort of ruling Scion from the shadows. She's assigned to a Rephite called Warden, who's meant to be like nurturing her magic so that she's more powerful and can give more power to the ruling family. And so Paige has to use that training and that nurturing as a way to try to get stronger in order to survive instead. The series is just insane in terms of the scope. It's so massive, like international politics and war and espionage, but still very focused on these like fantasy elements and so focused on the characters. They're very good, very interesting. Also, this is the first time I've listened to the audiobooks, and the audiobooks are excellent as well. I do recommend that you read the author's preferred versions if you can, but even the first time I read them when they first came out, they were excellent. But now let's get into the books that I am classing as my top 5 reads for the winter season. And we're going to start with 5 through 3. And that's because we have 3 books that are kind of part of a series. And that is Delilah Green Doesn't Care, Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail, and Iris Kelly Doesn't Date, all by Ashley Herring Blake. These are sapphic romances that follow 3 friends. The first one is Delilah Green Doesn't Care, where our titular character Delilah Green has to go from New York, where she lives, to her Pacific Northwest hometown to photograph her estranged stepsister's wedding to a really horrible guy. And she ends up getting more involved than she wants to, especially with one of her stepsister's best friends, Claire, who is a single mom and is wonderful. The second one is about said stepsister, Astrid, so no prizes for guessing the fate of that marriage to the awful guy. But she's a struggling interior designer who's given the chance to renovate a local inn for a TV show. But while she's doing the job, she's butting heads with the daughter of the family who own the inn, named Jordan. And then the last one is about Astrid and Claire's other best friend, Iris, who has sworn off love after some really, really bad experiences. And she starts fake dating a stage actress named Stevie because she needs fodder for her new romance novel. meanwhile, Stevie is trying to convince her ex that she is over her. All three of them are fantastic. I will say, like a lot of rom-coms, they require a bit of suspension of disbelief. You have to just kind of be willing to go along with the hijinks. They are so much fun, but also they have so much heart. I think that what Ashley Herring Blake does really, really well, which I really admire as a romance author myself, is the stories aren't just about the romance. These characters all have fully fleshed out lives, struggles that go beyond just their love lives, whilst the romances are the immediate catalysts for their character arcs, which I think is actually really important in a romance, that the relationship between the two main characters is actually fueling the character arc. Those character arcs themselves end up being bigger than said romance and more impactful for the character and every facet of their lives. And I think that that's really hard to do in a way that still feels really swoony and still feels like a good time. And she really nails it. All three books. I was trying to choose a favorite so that I could rank them within this. And you'll see on screen what I've kind of landed on. But honestly, it felt impossible because every time I tried to rank them, I ended up convincing myself that I'd gotten it wrong. Also, these are very spicy romances, and the spice is excellent. It's very good. I would definitely recommend reading them in order if you're open to reading all three, just because you'll get the appreciation of like seeing how the previous couples are doing, but I would say they work as standalones. I would compare them to if you've read like the Brown sisters romances from Talia Hibbert, so I gotta remember what they are. Get a Life, Chloe Brown, Act Your Age, Eve Brown, and Take a Hint, Danny Brown. I've definitely said those out of order, but I think that's the point. I read them out of order, and I would definitely say that those all work as standalones, and you just get like cameos from the previous couples. The previous couple involvement in these is more than just cameos, like they are best friends and they all live in the same place, so it does drive the story forward a little bit, but I still think they work well as standalones, and I don't think you need the context of the previous stories to fully appreciate what's in front of you. In fact, I would say at times it feels like the author has made a deliberate attempt to separate the stories, even to the point of, you know, in Iris Kelly Doesn't Date, what she does for a job is somewhat different to what she did for a job in the previous books. So she's done a really good job of like giving you a good starting point at the beginning of every book. All three of these books are fantastic. I loved all of them. I would recommend all of them. They're some of the best. This is a bold statement. They're some of the best contemporary romances that I've read in a long time, I think, just because of how fully fleshed out these characters feel. They have hopes and dreams, they have flaws, they have strengths, they have hang-ups, they have interests. And I think it's so clear from page one in all of these, what is driving these characters forward? Why are they making the decisions that they're making? And like I said, you do need to be willing to just go along with the hijinks a little bit, but not in order to understand the characters. It feels really well grounded in the characters, even if the situations feel far-fetched. I think Ashley Herring Blake has done a really good job of kind of nailing that. And even then, the situations aren't that far-fetched, okay? We're not talking about like Beth O'Leary types of far-fetched situations. I don't know why she was the first one that popped into my head. I think because the flat chair was just such a ridiculous setup, but so good. Also a good book. But like there are far more ridiculous setups. The number 2 book that I read this winter was actually a Christmas book. So stick with me. I know it's not Christmas anymore. In fact, it's getting very warm and sunny where I live. Probably fool's spring, but I'm going to hold on to it anyway. But the Christmas book that I read and loved, it was The Elven Days of Christmas by A.K. Caggiano. It's meant to be like the 11 Days of Christmas, but it's Elven, get it? And this is about Piper, who is hosting her large extended family for Christmas. And she is obsessively devoted to making Christmas special for her family because that's what her mom always did until she died 5 years prior. The family do not show appreciation for what Piper does and for how hard she works to make sure that every single moment of their Christmas visit, which let's insert here, is absurdly long. Her family is staying with her for like 2 weeks or 12 days, I guess. That's ridiculous. That many people in the house for 12 days. I don't think most people do that. But it's fine. It's the premise of the book, and we're going to get around to why that's okay. But she works very hard to make sure that every single moment of their Christmas experience is perfect, including the tree. She goes to chop down a tree herself. Turns out that tree was kind of magical, and an elf named Cole, K-O-L, but of course like getting coal for Christmas. He is an elf who works for the Elven Perennial Association. Cut my notes down here. There was no way I was going to remember that without my notes. And he's checking up on his groves of trees, I guess. I don't actually remember what he's doing. He's looking for the magical tree just to check on it, and he discovers that Piper's cut it down to use as her Christmas tree, and he traces it back to her house. They decide that fake dating for the entire duration of her family's Christmas visit is the only effective way for him to keep an eye on the tree without her giving it back to him, which she is not going to do. If that sounds ridiculous, and if you're like, Sam, weren't you just saying that the Ashley Herring Blake books required suspension of disbelief, and now you're talking about this? Yes, I know. But that's kind of the point of this book. It's incredibly tongue-in-cheek. I mean, there are moments where it says, I think there's one point where Cole has just come to the house, and it says something like, the family looked and they would have asked questions, except their indifference was necessary for the plot. And like, oh, there was probably some reason why she should have questioned that, but she couldn't think of any at the time. It's very, very self-aware. It's almost to the point of breaking the fourth wall and saying, this is a silly romance. We're not taking this seriously. Just go with it. And it does it really effectively. And I think the reason why this is so effective is because despite that silliness, despite the self-awareness and the lack of taking itself seriously, it's actually also very sweet. The romance is good, the characters are interesting and funny, and you actually care about what happens to them at the end. I was so surprised by this book. I was surprised at first by how much I was enjoying it, how much of a fun, good time it was, and then I was surprised at the end by how much I cared that it was over. I've not read anything else by this author, and I keep meaning to go look and see if she's got anything else because she just did it so well. Like I said, the book doesn't take itself very seriously, and neither should you, but I do think that it's really worth your time. I think whether you're a romance lover normally or not, I think that this book does it in a way that even non-romance lovers would be willing to go along with it because, again, of that self-awareness that I mentioned. And finally, we've got the number one book that I read this winter. Easy decision. That is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. I saw so many reviews from people whose taste I really trust about this book, and it still took me so long to pick it up. I'm actually embarrassed. This is a period fantasy romance. It's like, okay, little bit of a tangent here. I have a real pet peeve for irrelevant comps with books. There was a phase like last year where everything was being comped, for example, to Gilmore Girls meets Practical Magic because there was one book that did that comp combination and everyone was like, oh my God, that sounds amazing. And all of a sudden everything was comped to one or both of those things. I hate when that happens. And I feel like Bridgerton is another one of those where so many things get comped to it. And it's like the only thing that makes this anything like Bridgerton is the fact that it's Regency. But the vibe is different or the plot is completely different. Half a Soul earns the Bridgerton comp, but it's also fantasy in that the existence of the Fae and like the fairy realm is sort of widely accepted, and there is some presence of like enchantment and magic in the world. And the story follows Dora, and she is an orphan who as a child had a really weird encounter with a fairy lord who appeared and kind of took something from her and basically made it so that she lacks strong emotions. She doesn't feel fear, she doesn't feel distress, she doesn't feel joy and glee. She like thinks those things, but she doesn't feel them. And as she grows up, this makes her be considered very weird. It's expected that she will not marry, things like that. So she ends up going to London with her cousin Vanessa, whom she lives with and who is her absolute best friend, because Vanessa is joining the marriage mart. And as they get there, instead of asking about the families and stuff like that, Vanessa is asking a lot of questions about the Lord Sorcier, which is a French term. And basically it's the person who is in charge of magic. So kind of works for the prince. Job description unclear, but he basically is magical in some way. He's like the authority on magic within the kingdom. But everyone says the Lord Sorcier is a horrible man, truly dreadful, and that she should steer clear. Dora doesn't know why Vanessa's interested in the Lord Sorcier, but everyone is like, oh, he sucks, but also he is kind of beautiful to look at. So Dora maybe wonders if Vanessa is interested in the Lord Sorcier. She's not sure. She goes on a little jaunt about town, which is very scandalous because she's unchaperoned, and she stumbles into this shop shop where she actually ends up meeting the Lord Sorcier, whose name is Elias, and also his best friend Albert, who is a physician. Two things turn out to be true. One, Albert is from a family who Vanessa's mom and their sort of host slash sponsor within London wants Vanessa to marry into. So they want Vanessa to marry one of Albert's older brothers, not Albert himself, because Albert is missing a hand from the war, and that is obviously not acceptable. But also, it turns out Vanessa wanted to come to London because she wanted the Lord Sorcier to help Dora heal herself, fix whatever was broken when this fairy lord came and took something from her. So Dora ends up spending a lot of time with Elias, who is grumpy, like everyone said, but she also ends up spending a lot of time with Albert because she's instructed to distract Albert so that he doesn't try to court Vanessa. As a result, she ends up helping them as they go to the workhouses because there's some mysterious illness spreading around the children there. Saying anything more would be spoilery, and I don't want to do that. I think that this book balanced the romance and the fantasy brilliantly. It was so good. It also really well balanced the Fae stuff and the Regency stuff. The Regency bit and the Marriage Mart weren't just a setting for this fantasy story. It is actively part of the story. And that is, I think, why it earns the Bridgerton comp in a way that other things come to Bridgerton don't. The romance was so good. And I will admit, there was a moment there where I actually didn't know who the romantic interest was going to be. But there were some lines that were so swoon-worthy that I just had to read them back again because they were so cute. I would class this personally as cozy fantasy romance. There are some moments of higher stakes. I would compare it to the first Emily Wilde book in terms of how towards the end of that book there is a situation that feels a lot more high stakes, but I think ultimately still feels very cozy. In fact, I would say that the way that the plot unfolds and the sort of feeling of conflict throughout and also the way it crescendos feels very comparable to that first Emily Wilde book. I was a little bit worried throughout this book because Dora having half a soul and the effects of that, she ended up feeling a little bit autistic coded. I was worried about all this conversation about healing her. It was giving puzzle piece, you know what I mean? And I didn't love that just because I was worried and I didn't trust that it was going to resolve in a way that I was okay with. I personally feel like it went in a direction that I was happy with. This was the easiest 5 stars I have given in a long time. I loved this book so much. I immediately want to reread it. The fact that it's not a series is breaking my heart. I just so desperately want more of these characters. She has written other books, I think, roughly within the same world, but they don't follow the same characters, and I'm really sad about it. This book is so good. Easily the best book that I read this winter, and I will not be surprised if it ends up being the best book that I read all year. It was excellent. Truly excellent. Those are the best books I read this winter. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know in the comments what you have been reading and loving because I need to make sure that I am just as successful in my spring reading. I post these book review videos about once a quarter, but in the meantime, I've got lots of writing vlogs coming your way, so make sure you're subscribed if you want to see those videos. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.